Hi, Jana. How are you doing today?
Hi, Taina. It's so good to see you, and I'm glad to be here with you.
You as well. I hope that you don't mind if I fawn a little bit, but I want to just do a proper introduction of you and just kind of what you mean to our training team. Jana Glass is an LPC certified in brain spotting, in addiction, and perinatal mental health, and telemental health, working with a bunch of different types of clients, but her specialties include fertility struggles, the perinatal period in general, miscarriage, stillbirth, and anxiety, depression, postpartum, OCD, and just different family situations, right? So she is coming to us today from Atlanta, Georgia, and provides consultation for brain spotting. Brain spotting is one of those things that we're very thankful that she has brought to the Touchstone community. Um, and she is helping practitioners integrate that into their practice. She teaches brain spotting phase one and phase two through the perinatal lens, and um, is just passionate about this population. So I would like to just really be thankful and give a moment of gratitude for Jana, because I think that this particular topic, right, like we love actually also schedule these. So I love to see the amazing diversity and importance of these. And when we're talking about birthing people in the perinatal period who are having struggles and challenges, I just really appreciate all of the practitioners who um, can really walk that line and help families move forward. So, Jana, thank you so much for being with us and sharing this very important topic with us.
Well, thank you so much. It's really is an honor. I think, as I hope people will get from this time that we have together, that there's so much overlap that happens between different vulnerable populations. And so when people are experiencing trauma, whether that's addictions or during the perinatal period, there is such intense vulnerability that comes with being in that phase and stage, and being able to see that overlap and build compassion for individuals having these experiences is so vital for each of us as practitioners who are choosing to work with these populations. So I just appreciate the opportunity. I love trying to share really solid information to help guide people as they're trying, to really help support people in their healing and finding their versions of better, because that's ultimately what we're all here to do.
I love that. Also, if you can tell me why mental health? Why didn't you become a nutritionist or a dentist? What brought you to this field?
I'm one of those rare people who always knew what I wanted to do, like even from a small child, and then I actually did it. But I think I've always been fascinated by different people's stories and how different people can be in the same circumstance, like maybe the same household growing up or the same community, but have such different experiences of that. So it always drew me to, I love hearing people's stories. I love working hard to understand their perspectives, what makes them unique, what impacts them culturally, what impacts them that makes their story just theirs, to then utilize that in their healing process and being able to honor that. So it's just kind of always been, I can't imagine doing anything else. And all the tests they give you of what you should be when you grow up, it all pointed towards that. And I actually followed through and did it.
That is amazing. What I'm just kind of thinking about is that at this stage of your career, you are doing both supervision and consultation with other clinicians.
Mhm.
So, can you tell us a little bit about how that is working for you and also what qualities you're trying to help cultivate for people, especially when we talk about that intersection of perinatal and substance use?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, first of all, when we talk about substance use at all, I think there needs to be a gut check for each person who's engaging in this in a professional realm, because we've got to really look at our own attitudes, our own values, and the lens that we see any usage through. Because we are allowed to have our individual opinions, but we also need to be able to have an open frame and an understanding point of view if we're going to work with people who are struggling with whether that's substance use, whether that's addiction, or trying to stay sober through this perinatal period. So yes, every mental health professional should be non-judgmental and really compassionate, but I think it ratchets up even more when we talk about substances, because there is still an energy around it that it somehow might be a moral failing, or the person just doesn't have enough willpower, and that not enough people are really attuned to the reality of this being a brain condition, that this really being a disease that really is something that is not about just try harder or just don't do it, etc. We wouldn't tell someone depressed, well, just don't be depressed, right? And so it's really having good, solid foundation and understanding of your point of view of substance use as a whole, being really grounded yourself in those beliefs as the clinician, and then just really having clarity on your philosophy and how you want to helpfully intervene with someone who may be struggling with substances, honestly, whether they're currently pregnant or not. Because a lot of people who struggle with substances do end up being parents. And so, this is not a one-time incident. We don't have something and it gets cured. It's something that is ongoing and that needs support throughout a lifetime. And so being able to have that compassion and recognize the overlap. I had mentioned the different vulnerabilities in the populations. So someone struggling with mental health is vulnerable. Someone who is pregnant or postpartum is vulnerable. And someone who is utilizing substances is also vulnerable. So really seeing those overlaps and being able to recognize how all of that interplays in their daily functioning, their daily life, and they're trying to survive. And then the last piece I want to bring in, just trying to frame out points of view, is I want to add another very important voice to this conversation. And there are people in this space who are using the lens of social justice and looking at how some substances have been used as medicine over thousands of years, and trying to marry those ideas and those cultural values and those traditions in our work that we're doing today. And so again, personal values aside, being able to see how that may culturally reflect for someone, and making sure that we are not approaching it from a point of bias or misunderstanding. So I think all those things together help frame out that kind, compassionate, open individual who truly wants to be helpful and help the individual identify their goals and reach them in a way that's trusting. Because if a client doesn't trust you, they're not going to share with you what's really going on. And if you don't know what's really going on, you cannot be the most helpful.
Jana, I know that you and I live in very different states with very different rules. So I'm wondering if you can share your perspective on what addiction actually is, because most everything is legal here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like a broad, sweeping, like overgeneralization that I'm sure people can call me out on. But I'm wondering what it looks like from the perspective of the therapeutic approach to consider when things are not necessarily illegal, and how that can have an effect not only on the parenting people, right? Because I don't think we're just talking about birthing people. I think we're talking about families. I think we're talking about keeping children safe, but also what happens next.
Yeah. And so living in a state where certain things are decriminalized, but technically nothing's legal. There is some medical marijuana prescriptions that do exist, but we're pretty much a nope state. And so, I mean, I think there's not agreement on what addiction even is in the field. You know, there's some overlap, but there's some differing opinions. But I do think the one thing that tends to stand out of all the various definitions that you could look up is that someone who is utilizing some type of substance, whether it's legal or not, because sometimes some of the most harmful substances are the legal ones. I mean, yes, cigarettes and alcohol are legal in Georgia, but nothing else is, right? And so those can be the most harmful. But at any rate, it's really being able to see that it's the usage of these substances with actual negative consequences, but that those consequences don't result in using less, that they're still persisting in the behavior, even though they're having consequences. And those could be natural and logical consequences. Those could be legal consequences. Those could be relationship consequences, work consequences, but that they're continuing to use ongoing despite these consequences. Some other things is it's really looked at as being a disorder that is ongoing, that relapse is part of that, and there tends to be a compulsion to seek the substance again, despite those consequences. You know, Gabor Mate really looks at it more as a behavior that gives you temporary relief and temporary pleasure, but in the long term is going to cause you harm, and that you can't give it up, even if the consequences are negative. And so there are many different types of addictions. They're not always substances. But I think the other piece to be aware of is that, you know, I really subscribe to that idea that the opposite of addiction is connection. And so I was reading a headline that, like, right now that people are really feeling very isolated as a whole and disconnected, and that, like, it could be considered the next national crisis. So you marry that along with a lot of times people who are pregnant are also isolated, and people who are having mental health symptoms are also isolated. And then if you add in addiction, there's going to be isolation and pull away from that as well. And so recognizing that some of the people who are hurting the most are using the substances to cope. And so to me, when you're talking about places where some substances may be legal, it's really helping the person look at their pattern of use and whether there are those consequences there or not. And that would be the starting point to make adjustments, just based on their circumstance. Because I've had some clients confront me and say, oh, so if I just smoke pot on the weekends after my kids went to bed, would you judge me? And I would say, well, that's not what we're talking about right now. Like, your usage isn't to that degree. It's much more, and it's spanning much more of your week, you know. But no, what people decide to do with little consequence, that's not for me to get involved with. But the fact that you ended up here and are needing that support because you are having difficulties during your week because of your impairment, you're trying to join with them in a positive way to help them get to where they really want to go. Because it's really scary. If the substance that they're using is helping, even temporarily, it's really scary, the idea of letting go of that. And that's why we've got to intervene in that trusting, compassionate way so that we can build other options in, so that they're not feeling a huge loss in stopping to use the substance, that they have an alternative towards that. So, you know, if people are able to use in a way where there's little to no consequence, it's legal, etc., then I think you have to look at that in the overall profile of why they're coming to see you and how that fits or does not.
Yeah, in my state, I say, so are you doing this because you're happy, or are you doing this when you're sad? Right. And so then we have different conversations about that. But yikes, I feel like you called me out on a couple different things, because I remember being that first time mom who was like super overwhelmed
Mhm.
and was so afraid of being judged. So when I think about substance use on top of that, I'm like, oh, right, because some people, and I had amazing supports. right? I have, in my culture, we do a cuarentena, right? So my mom came over for 40 days. She took care of the kids. I didn't have to do much. But I'm thinking about, in the US, like we don't have a lot of those supports. So I wonder, like, just how many people are coping by using substances in pregnancy.
Yeah. Well, about 5% of all pregnant women are going to use one or more addictive substances during their pregnancy. And I guess on a whole, that doesn't sound like that much. But when we talk about 6,300,000 people being pregnant a year in the US, we're really looking at around 318,000 people who are going to be pregnant and utilizing some type, at least one type of substance during their pregnancy, which is significant, and how to be able to reach those folks and get them the support that they really need during that time.
Jana, is there like a particular, is there like a, what are they using? Are people drinking? Are people using, are people smoking? Like, what does that look like for them?
Yeah. So what we really see in the literature is that the number one substance that's used during pregnancy is tobacco. The next one is alcohol, then marijuana, and then that's followed by cocaine and opioids as far as drugs of choice. So if you notice, those first 2 to 3, depending where you are actually legal substances. And of course, well, I guess you could have an opioid prescription, but the others are not typically legal.
It's I'm just thinking about when I think about my caseload and my clients, should I be looking at adverse childhood experience scores? Like how do I identify that in a way that gives me the heads up? Because not everybody's going to come into our office and say, "Hey, I'm doing this." So how
Yes.
do I look out for that?
Yeah, no, for sure. And so we do see a correlation between the adverse childhood experiences scale, which hopefully most people are utilizing with their clients. And the higher the score, the higher risk factor for substance use. The other things you want to be asking, because, especially in the beginning, while trust is being built, most people tend to hold back on their usage. And even the people who see me who are not able to get pregnant, they're usually very, they hold back a lot of the details of their usage because they're trying to gauge my reaction. And so if I ask something like, how many drinks do you have a day? Generally speaking, they're going to cut that number in half, whatever they tell me, right? So the kinds of things we want to be looking for and kind of screening through a conversation. I mean, yes, you can use measurements and there are measurements out there, but I think having an open discussion with open-ended questions and being able to look at even their past usage of alcohol, nicotine, or other drugs, because past usage is a risk factor. We know for trauma, this also overlaps, but if the pregnancy was not planned, there is a higher risk factor. Looking at the educational level of the person, because unfortunately we see the lower levels of education as a risk factor as well. Not being employed is a risk factor. And again, y'all are going to hear, for those of you who are used to perinatal trauma, these a lot of overlap. Being a younger age during like a teen pregnancy also increases that risk of substance use. Any challenges with physical or mental health, that past trauma, whether that's ACEs or something else. Looking at their current environmental stressors and how stressful their environment is. And then intimate partner violence. If that is occurring, there's exponentially higher risk for substance use. If they have easy access to substances, and if honestly they really don't know about how substances can impact fetal development, that's also a risk factor. So as we're in conversation and screening and trying to gain more information, when you are checking on some of these areas, again, just because someone has a risk factor doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it can help you make the next steps of what psychoed you be providing, or what other kind of interventions you want, just to try to help mitigate any poor outcomes.
Yeah, so when I think about administering the ACE with my clients, I also think about administering the resiliency scale because I like to think about like, okay, what things do you have going for you? What are things that are helping? Um, but I have, like the question that's going on in my mind right now is how do we help build this community that is supporting these birthing people? Like, how do we make sure that their needs are being met? How do we, not only as therapists, but how do we as a community, right? Like these people live next door to us. These people might even be in our homes.
Mm-hmm.
How do we do that?
By raging against the systemic inequality, to be honest. I mean, because if you look at the things I just listed, a lot of those are not, it's not on the individual to make those changes. It's in the system to be able to make more support. And so I think part of it is being an open, when you're talking about outside of a professional role, like being an ear to people. And when you are seeing something that you're like, something's not right there, like actually trying to engage the person. They may or may not be able to open up to you, but I think on a ground level, that makes a huge, huge difference. But a lot of these things, it really has to do with being able to build better programming and support at a community level. And yes, that can be facilitated by community members, but that it matters where you put your votes. It matters where your local money goes, and really ensuring that we have more in place for people who learn they're pregnant and we're not planning that, for people who are underemployed or not employed, and trying to really help people. It takes so little to be able to help people really be self-sufficient in the grand scheme. And so really changing that paradigm of that system is so key. But it starts with being able to call that out and being able to not blame the individual for their set of circumstances.
Yikes. So there were different periods of my life where I had different judgments, right? I had different perspectives. I thought, well, if you just make all the right decisions, and we know about the fact that some people don't get to make mistakes. And if they make one mistake, it can really derail their entire life. So we have somebody asking, what's the data around alcohol intake and the impact on the fetus, harm reduction versus one drink a day? And Joel, thank you so much for that question because like I know that because I was a birthing person, people would say, "Oh, you can have a drink of wine." I'd be like, "Do you know how hard I worked to get this pregnancy?" Like, we're not doing that, but I don't know what the data is. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I'll speak. This is specifically about alcohol. And so it's very well established across the medical field that it is a teratogen and that it is not safe during pregnancy. I'm sure most people have heard of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And globally, it's the leading known form of preventable birth defect and developmental disabilities. About 8 out of every 1,000 people in the general population have some kind of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And 1 out of every 13 pregnant women who consumed alcohol during a pregnancy would give birth to a child who has some kind of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. It can manifest in lots of different ways.
Jana, can you repeat those two statistics because my mind is blown and I'm trying to process.
Sure. So 8 out of 1,000 people in the general population will have some kind of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. and 1 of every 13 pregnant women who consumed alcohol during pregnancy will give birth to a child who has some type of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. But this will depend on the amount consumed, the timing in the pregnancy consumed, and that overall pattern of drinking. So that will impact how that the spectrum would manifest with a child.
So if you can get pregnant the old-fashioned way,
Yeah.
and right, like I just want to ask this because I know that sometimes people come with this question and you happen to not know that you are with child.
Mhm.
Are there thoughts about that? Are there like, because we feel like in that first maybe month, 2 months, people might not know. How does that affect things?
Sure. I mean, so I think that is going to be more of a case by case basis, but it's understandable if someone is consuming when they do not know. But, our hopes is that upon knowing that they would at least decrease their usage. I mean, I think a lot of people who find out they're pregnant do stop completely. There's a well-known author who tells her story about that, Glennon Doyle, and she talks about finding out she was pregnant and being really, really highly in her addiction actively and making a decision on the bathroom floor that she was never going to use again and hasn't. But I don't think that that's a realistic point of view to take for everyone. And that, yes, it's a huge motivator, but also trying to remember that this is a brain challenge. This is a disease. And so it's not just as easy as being like, oh, well, I'll just stop. But we would like for people to at least get the support that they would need to be able to mitigate any challenges. Because besides just the fetal alcohol spectrum, the other things we see with alcohol consumption that negatively can affect the child are growth deficits, behavior problems, cognitive and motor challenges. And, for some people who use during pregnancy, the outcome can be miscarriage or stillbirth. The baby can weigh significantly less than otherwise, be small for their gestational age. There's an increase of preterm labor, and of course, the potential for infant mortality. And so for those of us who do this work a lot and see this in populations where alcohol wasn't consumed, the idea is really scary that could be increased through that usage. It's mixed with the low alcohol. The research is like if you just consume a little bit, but we've seen that even low levels of alcohol exposure could impact brain development. So the stance in the medical community is that no amount of alcohol in pregnancy can be considered safe, and trying to abstain as much as possible. And that part of the key piece of that is having a consistent message from all providers around that. And so it's not about shaming people who are struggling with decreasing. It's about informing them and then meeting them where they are and figuring out what the possible solutions could be for them, and how to help support them in that process.
So 5 different questions because I am like taking in this information and I'm grateful, and also I feel like for those of us who don't specialize in this community, that can be a little bit overwhelming. So I guess my first question is, are there consequences for people who might be using substances while they are pregnant?
For themselves?
Yeah, for legally.
Oh, so this is part of the other challenge around disclosure. It depends. I mean, I'm speaking more in the United States right now, but there is criminalization of usage during pregnancy in many different states. I think most people who are tuning into this are aware of the different legal battles that are being waged around like when someone is a person. And I think the states that define that more at conception are the states where it's going to be seeing more legal charges around usage during pregnancy. So that's part of the challenge around disclosure, is that if someone wants to seek help and wants for things to get better, if our response is, oh, okay, well, now you have legal consequences and we're going to take your child when they're born, et cetera, no one is going to share that. And so being able to really have the support of the different community agencies in your area, so that, you know, so many times people will go and end up in an ER or a doctor that they don't have rapport with. And if they share any information, it ends up leading to hospitalization, etc., and a lot of more negative consequences, rather than trying to look at this as a problem that is solvable and that we can try to assist. Because people hiding it, the truth is still the truth, and the consumption is still the consumption. And so,
Holy crap, that just hit my entire brain. That is such an I feel like that the truth is still the truth and consumption is still consumption, just like hit me like a truck because yeah.
well, so if
Um
someone looks at you and says, nope, I'm not using anything, like what's happening is still happening. And
right,
so instead
right,
of having them feel isolated and alone in it, that's
right.
why
Community.
there shouldn't be criminalization around it. I understand the mentality on a high level, but on an actual working with people who most people really care about their child in the making,
Right, right,
and
right,
really
right.
do are, and if they are seeking help, they are trying to do things
Yeah.
better and different. And so we absolutely want to try to meet them with, you want to do better, we want to help you do better. And, you know, don't get me started about incarceration and pregnancy. That's another webinar.
Oh my gosh. And I just signed you up for a 2024 Tuesday tea around that. So yes, I'll do that. So one of the first gifts that I received when I had my children was a big mug that said "Mommy's wine mug," and and I got the humor behind it, but
Mm-hmm.
also I feel like there is this potentially like yes, I think it is about that piece where we don't have communities for moms, that moms, birthing people, parents are really struggling to be successful in a situation that is, gosh, unhelpful, capitalist, and all of those things. So, so can you speak a little bit to this? I think it was called like wine culture for parents. Like, what does that look like?
it I completely respect that birth givers are not always female and that not everyone uses the term mommy, but I think the way the marketing community has phrased this is more mommy wine culture.
1000%.
And like, so like being inclusive, but just I think that's the target audience. And so I get it. On one hand, people are like, can't you take a joke? This is lighthearted. People have a rough day, blah, blah, right? But it's, the idea is that after a hard day that you need to drink wine or another alcohol beverage to get through the day. Like we see it in media, we see it in greeting cards. There are wine glasses that say like it's 5 o'clock somewhere, or mommy's juice or whatever, right? Like, so, you know, I think my own kids like were asked for like Mother's Day, like what's mommy's favorite drink? And one of them said wine, but I actually don't drink wine very much. And so I asked her when I got it, like, what made you say wine? And she said, all my friends were saying it, so I said it. And I was like, because you don't see me drink wine, right? But like, that's how pervasive she was 4 years old, right? Like, so, I mean, the reality is drinking wine can feel instantly relaxing after a long day. But what we don't want to do is forget that the individual that's being targeted is usually having a double burden of both paid and unpaid work. and a disproportionate amount of unpaid work inside the home, especially compared to their partners, and that it leaves very little time to relax. So I get it, like a glass of wine could be very appealing, but really women need to take time for themselves, and it doesn't have to be like wine is kind of mentioned on a surface level, but what they're really looking for is some relief from all these burdens. And so really I think the danger is that it's normalizing a problematic behavior, and that, some people say, but it helps me fall asleep quicker. But the reality is that alcohol affects the quality of someone's sleep, and you don't feel rested. So it's actually contributing more to what you're trying to solve. Alcohol is not good for our physical health. And it's so easy to just have a little bit more and a little bit more. And, people can eventually end up with problematic drinking all the way through to addiction. But the reality is that, if you start to experience withdrawal symptoms from alcohol, like it is potentially fatal. It's not no big deal. So I think as a whole, alcohol use and abuse goes unnoticed, especially in America, but it's common and it's rising. And so I think having that mommy wine culture, it normalizes the drinking. And I think it makes it harder for people to spot when they're really having a problem. And it takes away from the issues that really cause it. And so managing the chronic stress and the work overload is important. And the other thing to take into consideration is that it implies that children are annoying or clingy or boring. And it can make kids feel a lot of shame or guilt for like, I'm the reason mommy drinks kind of, right? I've seen t-shirts like that, etc. But it's really an unhealthy idea. And it also shows, like we know from research, that the biggest impact on a child's usage, especially in their teen years, is their parents' attitude and behavior towards alcohol. And so someone who is using that as their escape, as their personal time, as their relief, it's going to exponentially increase the odds that their child will do the same. So I just think, yeah, I can take a joke, ha ha, but that it really, if we look at it a little bit deeper, it can really just manifest and help persist some of the challenges that people are really facing in their lives, especially as parents.
We have a couple of questions on non-alcohol related questions in the
Sure.
chat. So there's two. So they're kind of like in a similar vein. So Joel is asking us, is ibogaine toxic to fetuses in the first weeks of pregnancy? And I know I've had some students do some research on ibogaine for their clients. And then the other question is, what do you think with substance use in teens? Because there are some teenagers, and Robin is bringing this to us, but like I've also heard people say like, oh, pot's not addictive. You can, so like how exactly can we be helpful as therapists in those conversations when people might be doing different substances?
Yes. So I'm sorry, I didn't hear the substance, like the word you said, it blipped for me. Like, is what
Oh,
harmful?
ibogaine. Ibogaine. I think that people are currently using it to see if they can work around. I get the research that I've seen is um, to reduce people's heroin usage.
Got it.
That Joel might be using that in a different context, but that's just like my reference for it.
Got it. So what we see as a whole for any kind, like whether it's about methadone or any other type of thing, is that yes, there are some potential negative impacts on a fetus, but they are less impactful in a negative way than the substance itself. And so obviously you've got to take each person on a case by case basis, but that it's going to be preferred if there is medication that is able to help, whether we're talking about blocking an opioid receptor or something else that helps steer away from that original substance, that's going to be preferred. But that the ideal would be being able to taper that off as well, as much as possible, because the ideal is the less substances, the better. But when you take a harm reduction approach, then that would completely be in the scope to try to utilize, obviously with medical team, etc. That's not something that would be directly in my scope of practice, but I would be joining with the medical doctors who are involved to come up with those positive solutions.
Yeah, and I love this. I love this idea of like we don't have to be the only people in the room. There can be other people in the room, and over time we build these networks, and we recognize the people who are kind of aligned with our similar goals for clients. I mean, I honestly, I think everybody wants their clients and their patients to be well, but if we have modalities that align, it can be really powerful for them.
Completely. And then your teen question, I heard it, but I'm not sure I got the full meaning. Do you mind rephrasing it?
Yeah, so when people say to teens, like,
Mhm.
oh, it's not like you can't be abusing stuff because it's just pot. Like, what does that look like? Hmm.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think some of that is having a relationship with a teen. And so, again, I currently live in a state where if you had, like you said, if you made mistakes, that the consequences are really high. So whether we talk about drug mistakes or we talk about an unintended pregnancy mistake, the stakes are incredibly high. And I've seen, even in my own practice, some of the teens were facing very long-term potential jail sentences because of what they were using, and where they were using it. And so being able to help people understand that, if they are really recreationally using and it's not impacting their lives, then that's one thing. But really being able to talk to them and see, like, are the things that are important to them in their life truly being enhanced by these substances, or are they being depleted by these substances? And so I think if you have the relationship and you have at least the basic trust established, then I think the teens will be sharing with you, I don't think it did make me run faster. I don't know that it did help me get a decent score on my test, etc. And making it applicable to their lives, because I think one of the mistakes people make with teenagers is talking too far in the future, and they're so now focused. So being able to say, like, when you want to go to college, and they're like, that's 5 years away. What are you talking about? But how they are being impacted right now. And like you said, are they using it because they're happy or they're sad, right? And being able to help effectively address what is pushing them to want to use. And as you work through that the goal would be to reduce and hopefully eliminate. But I think it's harder and harder because I do see it as part of a peer culture thing. And it's real hard to get teens to give up their peers.
Right, right. Um, so how do we do the screening for substances in a way that is non-judgmental, like in that we're assessing, but we're not saying, hey, and this is bad. We're saying, hey, this might be concerning, or what are your goals around this? Help
Yeah.
us with that.
Well, I think I start by asking the same questions to everyone. And that kind of being, even though the client you may or may not explicitly tell them, but I think part of that is shaping your practice to not be biased and to have it be a standard that if you screen for certain things, you're screening everyone, even if their answer is nope, 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 right? Like to everything. That I think that's part of it. And that you're not, so it's not, oh, I think this person may need this screening or not. It's these are the screenings that I do. And so, yeah, if they're saying no, you don't have, at the time, being able to say, well, and I usually joke, but say, like, if anything changes, feel free to let me know. Right? And I would usually say, some people are put off by these questions, but I'm asking because the more that I know, the more helpful I can be to you. And I think being genuine and authentic and really being able to constantly let them know that the non-judgmental approach is going to be taken everywhere, and that it's really how you view your work with them. It's not just, oh yeah, I'm going to check this box. That I
Yeah.
think they will feel that. And again, some clients will come back and be like, remember when I told you I took 4 drinks a night? Yeah, it's really 9, and some don't.
Mm.
But I think the bottom line is being able to know that a lot of people are going to temper their answers because they're afraid of
Mhm.
what you're going to think or what you may do. And so,
Yeah.
being able to convey that, and, I think people get confused around mandated reporting, not to take it right, like too far out.
Right.
But again, I
Right.
think that that's part of your philosophy and approach as your practice. But again, if you're deeply concerned, then that's when you want to get other entities involved
Mm.
who are going to be able to intervene in a way that's helpful to this individual, that makes them happy that they shared and doesn't make them regret telling you.
And so I think that's the key there. I think that in this whole conversation, I mean, you've given us so much helpful tips, but people being able to share in a way that they are not necessary, like unless they are in immediate danger. So I remember when I had just had um, my children have an amazing pediatrician. But you know the Edinburgh, that
Mhm.
screening tool where they're just like, how horrible of a parent are you? That's how I interpreted it in the height of my anxiety, right? So not judging the screening tool, but just saying like I read that and I said 0. And
Mhm.
so I'm wondering like what would you have done if it was a really high score? Like would you just because back then we didn't really have access to a lot of services.
Right.
Um, so is there this piece where we can identify, but then also get people the right supports? Because I feel like that can be. Are we just smashing the patriarchy later today, or like I'm not sure what to do.
I mean, I think it's hard because I'm in what on the outside you would say is a well-resourced community as a whole, because it's a major metropolitan area, but there's still huge gaps in so many different services, whether the gaps are because who they don't take, or what insurance they take, or what populations, etc. Because you didn't ask this, but I think part of the challenge with getting substance abuse treatment for people who are currently pregnant is, if you look, a lot of the programs will disclude them from being able to be in the program just by virtue of being pregnant. And so that's complicated because sometimes that is licensing laws, right? Like, so depending on the license that they are carrying as an organization, I'm not talking about a professional license, whether they are permitted to take pregnant people. Some people are not able to get adequate liability insurance for the liability you take on for a person and a pregnancy. And the other piece is some people just do not have staff who are adequately trained to be able to support someone during a pregnancy as well. And so that's part of it, is that you might go, oh, wow, these 10 awesome programs. Oh, wait, 7 of them won't even talk to her or the birthing person because they're pregnant. And so, I mean, I think between that and just overall access and then availability, because the programs who can serve a lot of these folks are limited in their bed space, et cetera. If it's going to be residential, obviously IOP has a little bit more robust numbers, but it's challenge after challenge. And so I think that's part of it, is then, like you said, being able to do the resiliency scale, seeing what strengths, assets, and resources they have in their own community, and building on those to try to help come up with the best plan of care to be able to help that individual stay as healthy as they can through their pregnancy, through the postpartum period, and through parenting. Because the reality is a lot of people who are able to achieve sobriety for a period of time up to 80% are going to relapse throughout their parenting experience. And that is not because they're not strong enough. It's because this is the nature of addiction. And that if you're in a highly stressed situation and you do not have the support that you need, it's so easy to revert to things that worked in the past. And that's why we want to try to really build sustainable solutions for people so that they don't have to fall back into those old patterns. But it's really, really challenging. And then so many of the programs who will accept these folks are not necessarily trauma informed. And so being able to touch on, for me working with this population, so many of the acronyms in our field can be helpful with the right challenge, but you need the right tool for the right challenge. And so for me, there is nothing that can be substituted for the deeper healing that comes from brain and body-based therapies. And so, we talk about, my tool of choice is brain spotting, but I think EMDR and somatic experiencing and possibly others that people resonate with, the ones that really help get to the trauma, integrated on a brain level and resolve it, are really the things that help long term. Because if you ask someone, why do you drink? Or why are you smoking? Or why are you taking pills?
Right.
They're not going to have an answer, right? Because if they knew the answer, it likely wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah.
But helping them really, really heal the old wounds that are pushing them to use today to try to soothe, to try to cope, to try to get through difficult times is such a game changer. And so being able to help people access those services is so huge. And, really helping them, that along with, of course, outside the scope of this today, but, a really long-term sobriety plan that works for that individual. And of course, there are lots of different options to look at there. But, that really helping them heal just the deepest underpinnings of what was even creating the desire to use to begin with.
Wow.
Gift.
That was a lot. Okay. So, so when you're talking about those bottom up versus top down strategies in therapy, brain spotting, EMDR, somatic experiencing, etc., what courses are you teaching? Where are you teaching them? And how can people get connected if they are interested to do? Because you do several trainings with us, and I'm thinking that you have a connecting. I was in my calendar recently, so I was like, connecting the rainbow. Is that what's happening soon? But you teach like at least 3 different courses with us. Can you just tell us, remind us a little bit about that? Because I am not a brain spotting person. And if you can just tell us, like, how is brain spotting helpful? How can this help people? How can people sign up? And what does that look like?
Yeah, no, for sure. And so the foundational courses of brain spotting, which is phase 1 and phase 2, I teach with the Touchstone Institute. They've been fantastic. But what it really does, it's an approach that really harnesses the body and brain's natural ability to heal. It creates the ideal circumstances for the individual to be able to release trauma that they have been holding subcortically, that is in their feeling brain. So it gets beyond the logical, rational part that a lot of talk therapy starts with, and helps them get to that deeper emotional experience and the memories that are held within inside our body of difficult past experiences. And for some people, those are stories that a lot of people experience, like being rejected or broken up with or being left out. And for some people, they can be more extraordinary. And so all of it, for someone who is experiencing difficulty today from something in their past, that falls under the trauma category for me. And so brain spotting really allows us to be able to process those feelings through to completion on a brain level, and allows the person to no longer feel like the past is present. It feels like the past is further and further in the past. And it's such a gift within healing, because you don't ever forget when something difficult happens to you, but it can be a lot easier to live with. And it does not have to feel emotionally activating today. And really being able to help people move forward in a way of, I have lots of ways to cope, and here are some of them, and here are the old ways I used to cope, whether that's substances or something else that wasn't helping them reach their goals in life. And now I can use these other things. But it allows people to have more regulated nervous systems, to be able to feel more calm and grounded, and be able to help them make healthier decisions today and going forward. So it feels like such a gift to be able to provide this to other providers to go help clients. And then the other training is much more perinatal trauma focused. I noticed that there was kind of an absence in the field. A lot of people talked about birth trauma, which is very important, and I didn't want to duplicate that. So I really started looking and training on the other areas when you're trying to build your family and it's not going the way you hoped, being able to really look at the different traumas that can happen on the journey to parenthood, whether those started from your own childhood, whether that's conception, whether that is trying to maintain a pregnancy, whether that's birth itself, or whether that is trauma that happens postpartum. And really trying to give a solid overview and frame for people who work with this population to understand what the person's experiencing. And then for folks who are trained in brain spotting, how to specifically have brain spotting integrated into the perinatal population in a way that really promotes healing. And so even if you never take brain spotting, day one is still really, really helpful for conceptualizing and understanding just where trauma can happen and how to help people make sense of it. Because so many people who end up in my office are like, was that bad? Was that bad? Like, am I as bad as other people? And it's not about comparing. It really is about how they were impacted by the events. But I think that's part of the human condition to do some type of comparison and say, oh, well, my friend had it worse, or this news story was worse. But the reality is trauma really is in the eye of the beholder. And so if it is overwhelming and impacts them negatively now, they need support, they need assistance. And I just feel like brain spotting, every time its potential is reached with each person, it feels like a miracle. And I feel so honored to be able to work with people in a way that helps them truly heal and be able to truly put difficult past events in the past.
Jana, I have spoken to a couple of people who have facilitated with your training, like Janelle, or have taken your training, like Tawana, and they speak volumes of you. So I'm only going to ask you one last question, which is, when are you going to be doing a training about trauma and addiction?
That part of why, I mean, been wanting to do this for a long time, and I'm really lucky because my mentor, who happens to live in Australia, her name is Dr. Robbie Abels, but she is one of the foremost experts on addiction in the world and utilizes brain spotting to heal. And so we've been talking for a really long time about this needing to happen. And so that's why when you asked me my topic, I was like, I'm going to do this one. So part of it is gauging people's interest. And so even if we don't have a ton of people who are live, if this is a topic of interest to you and you know people who it's a topic of interest, have them watch the replay. Have us be able to see the amount of interest in this. And really, this was not enough time to hit all the various topics that fall under this umbrella, but it was a good start, and really trying to build out more time and space to deepen this understanding and come up with long-term sustainable solutions, because these populations are relying on us to be able to show up and give the kind of support that makes the difference.
I can sit and talk with you for 15 more hours about how this is really actually about race, class, gender, social justice, and all of the amazing things, but also about treating birthing people as human beings. So I really appreciate the fact that you have brought this knowledge into our space today. I thank you for taking the time out. And I appreciate you, Jana. So thank you so
Thank you
much.
for the opportunity. And hopefully this is sparking people's interest and we can continue to build on this conversation. And I look forward to connecting with people in the future.
Thank you. Big hugs.
Thank you.
Take good care.